Now we're going to map out some of the different strategies that have been used to confront fascism, especially from the revolutionary left, and to outline a bit of what our strategy today could be. The first is liberalism. Liberals often make moralistic appeals against hate. They work to defend the integrity of bourgeois democracy and ward off attempts to usurp it. They often rely on the state to stop fascism, for example, using hate crime legislation or effective policing at demonstrations. Obviously, leftists have many critiques of this approach. First, the liberal approach overlooks the fact that the economic crises which fuel fascism are really an inherent part of the capitalist policies that liberals often champion. So simply electing a sort of tolerant bourgeois candidate in a period of crisis in order to ward off the right can actually lay the conditions for fascism's further development. Second, liberals often work to uphold universal rights and principles that they believe apply equally to everyone, like free speech or nonviolence. But this approach really breaks down in the face of fascist movements, which have no interest in maintaining those universal rights. So fascists will happily take advantage of free speech protections in order to build a violent street force designed to prevent oppressed peoples from speaking in public. Thirdly, liberals often rely on the state to stop fascism, for example through the courts, in ways that can easily be turned against the left as well. And in fact, sometimes liberals support state repression against leftists as well as fascists because they view them as sort of equally bad. And in this way, liberals often prevent the development of militant movements that could actually prevent fascism from rising to power, and so they actually lay the conditions for their own defeat. Now we'll look at some anti-fascist strategies used in the history of the communist movement. And the first one is what's sometimes called the Third Period, which was a time in the history of the Communist International during the Great Depression and the rise of fascism, in which communist parties globally tried to launch revolutionary struggles. The strategies that communists deployed in this period were shaped by their reading of the world situation. So they believed the terminal crisis of capitalism was imminent, it was happening, and it would increasingly drive workers toward revolution. They also believed capitalists and political elites would resort to increasingly authoritarian means to cling to power, and this included the social democratic parties, some of whom were in state power, and this made them as big a threat to the revolution as the fascists. So based on this understanding, communists built independent communist organization from trade unions on up and tried to launch revolutionary uprisings, insurrections, all while maintaining harsh opposition to social democracy. The strategies that were employed in the Third Period were positive in that they built an independent communist movement in many countries, and they tended to push forward struggles rather than holding them back. But they also had a lot of shortcomings. First, they undermined efforts to unite the left against fascism. Communist parties in this period often refused to collaborate with social democratic parties or groups, either in the street or in government, and in some cases this gave fascists room to grow and maneuver. At their extreme, parties in the Third Period actually came to view social democrats as a greater threat to revolution than the fascists, and so they were the ones really holding back the revolutionary tide. And in some moments, communists actually blocked with fascists against the social democrats, or anticipated that fascist electoral victories could be a positive thing for the communist movement. In Germany, there was a slogan at one point that said, "After the Nazis, us." Finally, the Third Period strategies generally rested on a kind of deterministic crisis theory. They understood capitalist collapse and worker radicalization as more or less inevitable, and this really underestimated the potentials of a fascist seizure of power, a revolution from the right, and the diversion of economic crisis through external war. This photo is a shot of the German Communist Party headquarters in Berlin in the 1930s. Next is what's called the Popular Front. The Popular Front developed in the Communist International after the Third Period, as communists took a defensive posture following the Nazi rise to power in Germany. In this time period, communist parties supported capitalist parties and governments in order to present a united front against fascist movements. So a popular front could be a formal alliance or an informal collaboration between communists and liberals in lots of different areas, from electoral campaigns to labor struggles to arts and culture and so on. In the US, the Popular Front gave communists maybe the greatest amount of political and cultural influence they had ever enjoyed, but it also came with serious shortcomings. First, communists frequently had to subjugate their politics and actions to the needs of maintaining this alliance with the bourgeoisie. In the US South, this meant the Communist Party had to give up organizing an independent, militant black movement against Jim Crow. Over time, this made the communist program in politics really indistinguishable from liberal politics, what some called liquidating the revolutionary struggle. Also, in defending bourgeois governments and subjugating revolutionary politics, communist parties came to rely on the bourgeois state to defeat fascism, whether through the courts or, in the Second World War, through their armies. And over time, this undermined the development of autonomous revolutionary organizations and fighting capacity that could confront fascism independently. So in the cases when Popular fronts succeeded, and they didn't always, they also defeated the revolution. This image is a piece of propaganda from the US Communist Party during the Popular Front that says, "Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century." Finally, there's militant anti-fascism. This refers to the strategy and tactics that have developed in Antifa and anti-racist action milieus, mostly in the US and Europe, since, say, the 1980s. These groups often operate as a united front of revolutionaries, so with anarchists, communists, and socialists together, which aim to confront fascists physically through independent fighting formations. Antifa groups often have a tenuous relationship with liberal or social democratic organizations. They might collaborate for particular actions or events, but otherwise maintain an independent ability to fight in the streets. Antifa groups have the benefit of building revolutionary opposition to fascism that can act on its own, but there are many critiques of them too. A main one is that Antifa groups often focus solely on the military dimension of the fight against fascism to the detriment of larger strategic discussion. They might stay essentially agnostic to any other cultural, electoral, or political elements of the struggle. And in this way, militant confrontation alone can actually fail to be integrated in a larger revolutionary strategy and get outflanked when fascists gain power in other ways, say through electoral campaigns. This image is sort of a glamour shot of militant anti-fascists in Europe. We're pretty sure it's the Revolutionary Front in Sweden, but correct us if we're wrong. An important case study to look at is the Spanish Revolution, which is really the only case in the early 20th century where a defensive struggle against a fascist coup attempt successfully transitioned into a full-on social revolution, even though it eventually ended in defeat. Now, the CNT in Spain didn't have a centralized policy in the same way as the Communist International, but the run-up to the Spanish Revolution in many ways mirrored the communist strategies we just described. So in 1931, Spain changed from being a military dictatorship to a republic, but the center could not hold. On the one side, the working class was demanding immediate improvements the government couldn't provide, and on the other side was a traditionalist right wing that was hostile to democracy in the first place. Starting in 1931, the Republican government began repressing strikes and demonstrations, and in response, radicals in the CNT launched a period of what's called revolutionary gymnastics, kind of similar to the Communist Third Period. They tried to launch insurrections and make the revolution right then, and fiercely denounced socialists and other liberal forces. From 1931 to 34, there were 4 attempted insurrections in Spain. They all failed, and they led to serious repression. In 1934, a Popular Front coalition made up of liberals and socialists ran in the elections. Now, weakened by splits and repression, and wanting to keep the right from assuming state power, the CNT tacitly supported the Popular Front by not advocating electoral abstention, as they did usually. Now CNT members could vote if they wished. In return, the Popular Front parties promised to free anarchist political prisoners and provide arms to the workers to defend the Republic, even though they never followed through. As a result, the Popular Front won the elections. But it didn't last long. In 1936, General Francisco Franco launched an attempted military coup with a coalition of monarchist and fascist groups supporting him. Now, the armed workers, led by the defense committees of the CNT, took to the streets and defeated the fascists directly. At the height of what became a popular insurrection, workers seized arms, the police and army disbanded, and state power effectively collapsed. With the Popular Front government no longer able to hold workers back, the insurrection became a social revolution, and workers seized factories, farms, and cities across the country. Now, the later course of the Spanish Revolution led to defeat, but this example shows us the usefulness of both defensive unity against fascism and independent organization and counterattack. This image is of a CNT defense committee in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. So what could a revolutionary anti-fascist strategy in the US look like today? We can synthesize some points based on the strengths and weaknesses of what's been done in the past. First, we can develop independent fighting groups to confront fascists directly. These could include revolutionaries from different tendencies and organizations, as well as regular working-class people who want to confront fascism directly, unlike the liberals. The skills and organizations developed here can be useful in other ways too, in other kinds of organizing. This image is of an anti-fascist rally that dispersed Nazis who were gathering in Sacramento in June 2016. Also, we can unite defensively with social democrats and liberals who want to avoid direct confrontation with the fascists, for example, at rallies in defense of legal rights, but we can counterattack independently against fascist groups. Now, these defensive alliances will only last as long as the liberals don't repudiate them, but this approach makes sure we leave open the most possibility for a united defense without limiting direct militant action and while building popular support for it. Third, we can out-organize the far right and the communities they seek to dominate. This organizing should peel away potential supporters of fascist groups by fighting for class interests, for example, with the white working class in the Rust Belt. And it should also provide an alternative worldview and explanation for things like deindustrialization, austerity, liberalism, and white supremacy, and it should do all that from a revolutionary perspective. Doing this kind of organizing requires integrating a militant anti-fascist approach within a larger revolutionary organizing and strategy. Finally, we can oppose white identity. Contemporary far-right politics in the US is really centered around different varieties of white nationalism, all of which ground themselves in a racial identity, which binds white workers to the white petty bourgeoisie and the ruling class, and pits the white working class against all other oppressed people. So we should oppose white identity. It could involve engaging in anti-racist solidarity in multiracial settings, or supporting queer and feminist organizing in white communities, which undermines the gender and family norms that are often central to a vision of a white nation. It could also involve opposing specific policies that benefit whites over others, for example in education or housing or policing. And that's it for part 2 of this presentation. Take a look at these reflection questions and hit us up with your thoughts. Thanks.